So this is my Lent uniform.
Yep.
But I realized that I got dressed up for nothing today.
Oh, because you're not doing the service.
Because I'm not doing the service tonight. So I'm going to change clothes after we get done with this podcast. So
I was just commenting. I realized that when we recorded this a couple weeks ago, we were both basically wearing the same thing. I've got a different purple shirt on, but it's a purple shirt.
Well, and that's why I do this, because Lent is 6 weeks, and it's like this thing that you're doing for 6 weeks, and so this makes it easy on Wednesday mornings. I get up, but I got up this morning and I forgot that I'm not doing the service tonight because it's early and I'm not thinking and I haven't had a cup of coffee. So I just did what I always do. I put on the uniform.
Yep.
I'm going to change out of the uniform after this. You're a student pastor.
Yes.
You're not a real pastor yet. Hence the title of the podcast. One and a half pastors.
Yeah. I'm not ordained yet.
Yeah.
I'm taking classes right now.
So you're in class right now, though.
Yes.
And it's a systematics course.
Yes.
Which
do you want to explain to people fancy word like what systematics
is doing? This is my tongue-in-cheek explanation. Systematics is doing theology like a long division problem. It's like a physics equation or something, or a chemistry equation.
Which of course means I love it.
Yeah, because you're kind of wired that way. I could do systematics. I can hang with those guys, but I always get a little uncomfortable because at some point it kind of feels like there's not always enough room for the kind of ambiguity that a guy like me wants to leave in the equation. I still want to have some areas of gray there. And but we need systematicians.
Yep.
We need guys that do theology like that. And the reason why we need guys that do theology like that, guys that are wired the way you're wired, is because Christian theology, especially by this point, 2,000 years, it's a thick system. It's a system that's thought through and talked about all kinds of things that have to do with God, with faith, and with life for 2,000 years, people commenting on and talking about these issues. And so it all, as a system, kind of all needs to hang together, as it were, right? And so we need guys that are wired like you to do theology that way so that the system still hangs together. And then we need guys like me to come and scribble all over it and mess it up. So it takes all kinds, in other words, is what I'm trying to say. Right?
Well, and I think part of it for me, too, is even looking at it of the system all hanging together is recognizing those moments when you're not really going to get an answer to the long division problem. You're not going to get the answer.
You're not going to get the answer. And I've said that theology is not about getting the right answer. It's about coming to a good answer. And that's some sort of paraphrase off of something that a really good teacher of mine taught me. And so, and that was liberating for me, by the way, was knowing that you're not always going to get to the one right answer. Because there's a lot of pressure on that if you have to come to the one right answer. I know that there is the one right answer, but he's a dude.
Yes.
He's a guy. His name is Jesus. He used to hang out in this neighborhood called Nazareth, And
well, there definitely is the one right answer of I am the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father except
right.
for me. But if you're talking about things that delve down into, non-fundamental secondary doctrine issues, my brain goes back to Isaiah 55 of my ways are higher than your ways, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts, and there's going to be some stuff that we're not going to understand this side of heaven, and that's okay.
We're not going to understand this side of heaven. And little shameless plug. I went to Chick-fil-A for breakfast today. I don't know if anybody from Chick-fil-A is going to see this podcast, but if you do and you want to send me like a free gift card, I would not turn that down. Anyway,
because Chick-fil-A has good breakfast.
They do have a good breakfast. So you're in a class right now, though, which is one of these systematic classes. It's a very organized way to do theology, but from what I understand, it's not one of these classes where they're doing theology like a bunch of syllogisms. It's not a logic problem like that. It's a different approach to that really super organized way of thinking through theology, and they're taking you through metanarrative.
Yes.
So here's your little quiz on the spot. That's not a word. you'll hear the kids that here around the school say things like cap or sus, or like, that's cap, or you will not hear the kids around here going, that's meta-narrative or whatever. Like, so explain to people what's a meta-narrative.
Well, I'll front porch it a little bit.
You might hear a college kid say, "You're so meta," and you don't even know it.
Yeah.
But
I don't think that's.
I'm not even sure they know what that means when they use it. So what's a meta-narrative?
Well, my brain goes in it. I'll front porch it a little bit, but thinking about how we look at the stories of our lives and how we look at the way that we make sense by understanding formative things that have happened in our life, whether that's in our families or whether that's more broadly speaking in a cultural sense. And we get to a meta-narrative, it's the idea that it's a shared cultural story that we share together as people. And that could be people as the body of believers in Christ. That could be people as Americans. That could be people as.
So if we're talking about meta-narrative,
and then it has a universal truth that's included with that, everyone kind of accepts that this is the direction that these stories as a broadly cultural story tell us.
So if we're talking about meta-narrative, like for Americans, for example. Mm-hmm. You're talking about an overarching story of an entire people. So what would be an example of American meta-narrative?
Manifest destiny. This idea that we can go and we can conquer the world, that we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, we're going to work hard, we're going to make good of the land. We have this idea that we're destined in a sense to go and expand and prosper. And
do you think Americans still have one overarching meta-narrative then? Do you think Americans still have one overarching story? Because that used to be the story, yes. Right? Was manifest destiny. But now you have things like the 1619 Project, and it questions that narrative.
Yep.
And seeks to supplant it with a different narrative.
Yep.
Like America is bad and evil and was just all based off of slavery from the very beginning.
Well, and you even see this in the context of the rise of let's call it postmodernism or post-truth. The idea that, and I think within that perspective, even you're going to get notions of questioning meta-narratives from the standpoint of just fundamentally questioning them.
Yeah.
Because some aspect of manifest destiny or whatever other kind of meta-narrative that you're looking at is somehow subjugating people.
Yeah.
It's a power issue. It's seen as a power issue. That this meta-narrative was some just social construct that was used to try to control people, and we didn't actually really believe it, or it's not actually really true.
Right. But whether you have one narrative for an entire people group like the Americans, or you have competing narratives,
yep.
Those narratives, even if they are competing, would count as meta-narratives because they are the story of an entire group of people.
Yep.
That's what you're saying.
Yep.
Right?
And I think
and then your personal story, are you saying that your personal story, then you would find how your story fits into the bigger story? Is that what you're...
Yeah, and the ways that those things resonate with you, the ways that you then find meaning in your life, the ways that you find value and identity about who you are because of the ways that aspects of those overall cultural stories resonate with you. And it can even be things that are smaller than a America-wide context. I think about it from the standpoint of looking that we live in Lincoln, Nebraska, and a lot of people really love Husker football. And there's lots of ways that people in this town, me included, sometimes find meaning and find identity in rooting on for a football team. And
there's the story of that program, too.
Yeah, there's a story of the program, there's the history of it, there's the tradition.
There are the sacred saints like... I'm going to get the name wrong. Osborne, is that the coach?
Yeah,
everybody. Good. Okay, all right.
You got.
I'm a Tennessee Volunteer, so this is weird that we're even living and working together in Lincoln, Nebraska. But yeah, okay. So there's the story of that program. It's a storied. We even say storied franchise or storied program, and it has its own saints with their statues and
Johnny Rogers and Junior Gill and all the players that have done all the things, and Devaney and Osborne and. But then you find value, you find meaning in life, depending on whether the team wins or loses, and it might make or break your Saturday. Frankly, I mean, there's people that make or break their week. I mean, alone just a Saturday.
Here's my confession of sin, right? So here's my confession of how I'm a broken, sinful creature. I had to quit watching UT football on Saturdays because it was putting me. Because we used to be good.
It was depressing, probably.
It became a dumpster fire of a program, and we've got a good coach now, so I think the future is looking a little bit brighter for us. But we're still not winning the way we were in the late '90s, right? So, and that's a long time to be that bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so
the
I had to.
Huskers aren't much better. But.
No, I know, but so I had to quit watching UT football on Saturday because I'd have to go to church and work on Sunday mornings. I had to smile at people, and it was a forced good morning, because I'm in a terrible mood still from the night before. So I'm definitely that kind of a sinner, but I hear what you're saying about Husker football because Tennessee Volunteers feel the same way in our fan base.
Yeah.
For our team, right? And so that's another example of meta-narrative. There's this narrative of the storied program of this team.
Yep.
And we feel that there's some meaning in being one of the fans rooting for that team. I think nobody capitalized on that idea better than the Green Bay Packers in the NFL, because the fact that the fans owned the stadium. I mean, you want to talk about feeling like you're really part of
this is our team.
This is ours. Yeah. This team is ours. And I don't think anybody has ever, in the history of pro sports, ever capitalized on that idea that your story fits into this bigger story than the Green Bay Packers.
Well, and another thing I'd say about it too is just as you look into this again, how do you find spots that you resonate with these stories, resonate with these narratives?
Right.
Is that there's in my mind, there's kind of four things that they're going to kind of piece into this, and then I want to dive into this in terms of what this looks like for the church too. But it's in one sense, these stories, these meta narratives are going to resonate with you because it's going to help you make sense of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, then because it helps make sense of the world, there's this journey or this purpose or this goal. You've got a sense of where things are going then, and where things are going to end up.
Right.
Then also within that story, that narrative, you've got an idea of what are the mores, what are the rights and wrongs, what are the virtues, what are the vices, how should you live your life as you're making sense of the world and going on this journey. Mm-hmm. And then finally, just, there's then psychological associations you can make with it in terms of, if it's Husker football again, and I can think about my dad taking me to the game when I was a kid, and that there's positive then associations, or there could be negative associations with it too.
And I like that idea of life as journey when you're talking that way. It reminds me, so the Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson has...
I'll nod like I know who that is, but yeah.
Well, he's a clinical psychologist. He taught for a lot of years, and he's written and spoken a bunch. And he's kind of funny to listen to because he's like uber Canadian, like educated. So sometimes he almost sounds British. Like he says BEEN as bean and stuff like that. But
sound like Strange Brew.
Yeah, I guess I don't. But he's a really smart cat, and he has said, when you talk about journey, he has said talked about life as like you're all in. Like, why do people think about life like they can't live it to the maximum today, like they're not already completely invested? I mean, you're alive, you're breathing, you are all in. You're here, you exist. Take that seriously, and take the fact that you're all in on this journey seriously. And so when you talk about that metaphor of life as journey, and the Bible speaks that way, right?
Well, I was just thinking about that. If you look at in our walk of faith, if you want to look at those
walk of faith, yeah. Right? Or early on, we weren't called Christians; we were called followers of the way. If you're following the way, it means you're walking a path, right? And so I love that metaphor of life as the journey. I think it's super helpful from a psychological standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint, to talk that way. And so what you're saying is, what you're learning in this class, what y'all are discussing in this seminar, basically,
yep.
is that they're talking about these big overarching stories and how that helps you to make meaning of your own story, of your own journey
yep.
of life. How are you going to make sense of your own journey, your own life, in light of a bigger story?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you've got the bigger story of Jesus, frankly.
Yeah.
Bigger story of, again, making sense of the world. We make sense of the world because we recognize that we're sinners in need of God's grace.
Mm-hmm.
And then the journey is walking in that faith that we've been given because of Jesus working the cross and the empty tomb. Through our baptism, we're walking in faith, knowing that we're looking forward to the day when Jesus comes again. So we're walking that journey in the midst of this life that's broken and still in sin, with a hope of life everlasting. And then clearly we've got the rights and wrongs of how you should walk that, the things that walking in the love of Christ versus walking in sin.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah.
Is that because you said a meta narrative, like we started with, like, for the Americans,
Mm-hmm.
right? What's the story of the Americans? It sounds like what you're saying is that as Christians, we as the church are a storied people.
Yes.
We're the people of a particular story. We're the people of a particular narrative.
And this narrative helps us make sense of the world we live in, this broken, sinful world that we live in.
I wonder what that says about identity. Tim Keller, Presbyterian pastor, he has said that there's this tremendous pressure upon people in American society, or Western societies in general, but especially in the United States, to create their own identity. Right? So you try on different hats as you're growing up, and you try on these different aspects of, who are you going to be, what are you going to do for a living, where are you going to live, all these things. And then it's a tremendous pressure on people to come up with their own identity. But if you're part of a storied people, much of your identity is actually bestowed or given as being part of this people of a particular story.
I'm a child of God who's a fellow brother or sister in Christ in the body of believers that we live in. And
well, that's just a creed.
Yeah.
One holy Christian church, one baptism, So but it makes you part of a storied people then, and then much of your individual identity is actually being given or bestowed upon you. It's something that's received, not constructed. And that's a very different idea if you believe yourself to be part of a storied people of a particular story.
And it's a story that has a ton of meaning because it's about resurrection. It's about life everlasting. It's about life beyond this miserable, sinful life that we live in right now. So it's a story that gives meaning that's eschatological.
Eschatology. You really are in a class right now. The meaning end times, right?
Yes.
Eschatological meaning the end times. So I was listening to a Hindu guru.
I'm curious.
On YouTube. I was listening to a Hindu guru, and he was accusing the West of getting rid of the idea of heaven. So everything has to be like gratification now because there's no heaven to look forward to. What you're saying, though, is that he may be able to level that against Western societies in general, like the United States, but that guru would be disingenuous if he leveled that at the Christian church in the West.
Yep.
Because people who are still part of that Christian faith and tradition are people of a story that has an endpoint beyond this life. We have not gotten rid of the idea of heaven. For us, it's still there. Maybe for American society, the idea of heaven is not something they take seriously anymore. But for Christians, it is still something that we take seriously. And so it shapes the way we live now because we don't believe that now is all that there is. We believe that there's an eternity that extends beyond the now for you and me.
And we live in that looking forward to that with certainty.
Yeah.
It isn't even just this abstract idea. It's a certainty thing that we know that we have, that we're going to have, I should say. But it also brings up a point, too, when you talk about that, even just American society versus the society of the church, or the American cultural identity versus the the stories of the church, is that as Christians walking in America right now, we're living in a world that has a whole bunch of competing things that are going to be running counter to this story that we live in the church. They're going to run counter to the story that we're our identity's in Christ, and it's an identity that He's given us, and we're walking in that story together. Because
when you go back to what we said at the beginning of this episode, which was where there's the story of Manifest Destiny, there's also the story of the 1619 Project. Those are two completely different and competing meta-narratives.
Yep.
Those aren't the only meta-narratives that our neighbors are walking in. And my point, though, about the heaven thing is that if it's true that Western societies have largely gotten rid of the idea of heaven, it means that you and I are making sense of our lives in light of an eternity, whereas our neighbor may only be making sense of his or her life in light of the here and now.
Of how much stuff can I get? How good can I be at my job? How much?
And then in the middle of that,
there's the social ladder. Those kinds of things.
Yeah, or how much drugs can I do?
Yeah,
like I mean, like it could be something as simple as just instant gratification.
Yeah.
How many people can I sleep with? Right. So, but then within that, though, there are these competing stories. So there's the story of LGBT, and are you going to fit that story?
Mm-hmm.
There's the story of, frankly, people who believe that in ideas like systemic racism, that racism is so bad in the United States that it's just this thing that's like the boogeyman everywhere, and that you can't get away from it. That idea. That's a story.
Mm-hmm.
That's a meta-narrative. That goes along with like the 1619 Project. There's the story of, America's some sort of God's chosen nation to bring light to the world or whatever.
Somehow Washington D.C. is the New Jerusalem, which I would
I'm pretty sure it's not.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that it's not. I think we call it the swamp for a reason.
Yes.
And so. But that's a narrative. That is a narrative. But whatever narrative you're working with, it is. It's like, where does the rubber meet the road with a seminar like the one you're in right now? I think that's one of the places where the rubber meets the road, is that it's helpful to understand as a Christian person, first of all, that you've been given an identity in a story, because we're a storied people. I think it's also helpful to remember that your neighbor is not necessarily living by the same story you're living by. They have a different story. And so sometimes it's helpful to know more about what does it feel like to be them. We talk about sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with other people, where you're basically telling them, like, you need to believe in Jesus. And there's truth to that, because if you had the cure for cancer and you didn't share it with people who had cancer, you'd be a terrible person, right? So if
and there's power in that story, because the Holy Spirit is at work as you share the gospel, and that can soften people's hearts, and they'll turn away from whatever they're in.
But it's also helpful to know what the other person's story is that they're living by,
so that you know what they're going to be able to resonate with, or understand, or what's going to seem,
or just so you can be a good neighbor and know what their story is.
Yes,
you're actually interested in the other person's story. Like, who are you? Where do you come from? What do you live by? If you do live in a pluralistic context,
which we do,
one way to live in that pluralistic context is sort of like the Amish. You just sort of circle the wagons and pull in and create this insular community that can exist all unto itself. And there are people in our circles who would like to see our Lutheran confession kind of be more like that.
Circle up the wagons and make sure we keep all the worldly people out.
Right.
Just and the good
and we'll just exist in our own little institutions. Or here's an idea, or you could learn to thrive in that pluralistic environment, recognizing that there are all these stories out there. So let me hear yours, friend. Let me hear yours, neighbor. And then I'm going to share with you mine. And that's not a threatening environment necessarily. That can be a very enriching and fun environment. And it doesn't mean that you're compromising the truth of your story if you really believe that your story is the truth.
Yes.
I think the problem for many people is that they only know their story as one of tradition. This is what I was taught as I was growing up. They are not convinced of the truth of what we believe is coming.
Or just getting to the point that this is actually a journey that I'm on, looking forward to when Christ calls me home or Christ comes again.
Right.
In the midst of living that journey, I'm going to try to follow Jesus' words and be the salt and light of the world.
Yeah, but I think there's plenty of people who are Christians they feel about their faith like, this is just what I was taught.
Yes.
And that's the reason that kind of a faith gets threatened in a pluralistic environment, is because that faith, you're not really convinced. You know what I mean? You're not truly convinced of the truth that it is that we have to share this good news.
You're not finding that same level or degree of meaning in the story.
Right. It becomes the story of how I was raised. It doesn't become the story of the Savior who came looking for me.
Yep.
And that's different, because the story of how I was raised is the story of a kid growing up in the Midwest. The story of the God who came looking for me is a much bigger story. It's epic, because that dude was living in the Middle East 2,000 years ago, and he came looking for me.
He came to find you and me and to transform our lives.
Right, and that's a much bigger story. When you become convinced of the truth of that story, that's a story that has no trouble living with other stories around it without sort of sacrificing the truth of that story. The reason you're so comfortable with other people is not because you're adopting part of a Hindu narrative or part of an LGBT narrative or part of a whatever group's narrative. The reason that your narrative is comfortable in the middle of all those other narratives is because you're absolutely convinced that this narrative is the story of what God is doing in the world.
I'll just say, look at the early church again. Following the way, you've got Peter and Paul and others that are facing death to go share this story.
Well, in the middle of pagan religion, like
in the middle of
polytheistic,
Roman
in Roman polytheistic religion,
but they're so convinced.
They're so convinced, that they don't have a problem.
Yep.
I'll tell you about the hope that I have, buddy. Like, I don't have a problem sharing this with you. And so that's why I say it's fun for Christians, I think, if you are completely convinced of the truth of the hope that we have in a cross and an empty tomb, to ask another person, well, tell me more about your story. That's not threatening.
Yep.
Because you want to know something about your neighbor.
And we've joked about this a little bit. We talked about the fact that I've been at Faith here now for just over a year. It's been a year.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a couple times where you've jokingly asked me, like, are you sure you really still want to do this?
Yeah, because it's such a weird time.
So it's such a weird time, but I've told you at the same
time,
for me, it seems like just the right time, because it's such a weird time. It's such a time when there's so many other things going on around the church, in society in general.
If you wanted to have an interesting ministry, this is the time to get into ministry,
because
it's not going to be boring.
And I'm ready to dive in and just see what God's going to do. So
yeah.
And I also told you to remind me of that later when it's
tough. Yeah. I gave you the out. I asked you. It's too late now. But yeah, and so I think that's really cool what y'all are talking about in this seminar, because you're kicking around some ideas that have to do. People, I think, get the wrong idea about the academic study of theology. I think they think that it's, out of touch or up in some ivory tower or something. But what y'all are talking about is where the rubber meets the road for all people, even if they didn't use a word like meta-narrative. Mm-hmm. They know that there's a story in their life, or they at least intuit, it's on an intuitive level. They feel that there's a story in their life that helps them to make sense of their life, even if it's just checking the sports page in the morning. There's something at the level of feeling and lived experience that tells people that their story is part of a bigger story. And to think through that seriously and what that means for the church, that's a worthwhile thing to be studying and talking about.
Well, I think for me, as I look at the class and we look at systematics as being the big long division problem that is trying to fit it all together, the thing I really like about this so far too is that there's aspects about how this all fits together, but there's a lot of very, very practical things about what does this mean for me is in this process of formation, about how I'm trying to communicate to members of the church, how I'm trying to work together with staff, and thinking through things that isn't just about how it all fits together, but how is it actually where the rubber meets the road for the, regular parishioner here, or for somebody in the community when you really want to tell the story about Jesus.
Mm-hmm. So, look at that, kids. Theology is not a waste of time. You too are a theologian. Everyone's a theologian, and the problem is not everyone's a very good one. But everyone's got an opinion about God, faith, or life, right? And so that means everyone's a theologian. And so I think that this is a cool little look
Yep.
into what's going on in the life of a student pastor and the kinds of things that y'all are learning and talking about and discussing. And so thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
So that we could kind of get a glimpse of, what it really is he doing over there with all that book learning, that schooling he's going through. What's he got going on over there?
You can throw out some fancy words if you listen to this and you're talking to somebody the next time. Metanarrative and eschatological. There's your two fancy words for the day, right?
What word was it you used in a sermon and somebody texted in and said, what does that mean?
Efficacious.
Efficacious, yeah. Yeah, Jesus is efficacious. And then they texted you, what is efficacious? So, yeah, you got big words if you want to throw them out there. Or, this is a better one. We've got some big concepts that we can find simple ways of relating and talking about. Big concepts, everyday language, right? So
absolutely.
All right. Well, I think we'll maybe wrap it up here, and we'll catch you next time.
See you next time.